Hi, class. Let's get into Chapter 3 of the American Yawp. We'll dive back in and talk about British North America. Now, this chapter is packed with key information about the developments of the British colonies, their economies, their relationships with indigenous peoples, and the roots of colonial self-government. So let's get started with this. Now, Section 1, the rise of British North America. We've already laid the foundation for this in earlier chapters. But by the early 1700s, Britain had established a strong presence in North America. Its colonies stretched from New England to the southern coast. Many of the competition had been driven out, like the Dutch. They pretty much give up New York without a shot in conflicts between England and the Netherlands in the latter part of the 1600s. So now New England in the north and New York and colonies such as that in the middle, with the Chesapeake colonies and the Carolinas in the south. Now, these colonies, though, while they're all a part of the British Empire, they're not identical. They're far from it. Now, the English were late to the colonization game compared to the Spanish and the French, but once they started, they expanded very, very quickly. Jamestown had been founded in 1607, and by the late 17th century, the British colonies were flourishing. They were doing very, very well. The colonies developed distinct regional identities and economies as well, but they all shared one thing. They're a part of a larger, interconnected British Atlantic world. Now, the colonies were deeply connected to the British economy through transatlantic trade. British ships traveled between Europe, Africa, and the Americas in what became known as the triangular trade. Now, there's many other small stories that fit that carry more detail into this. Remember, I'm not getting detailed. I'm just kind of painting the big picture here. But this system shaped not only colonial economies, but also social hierarchies as well. Now, Section 2, colonial regions and their economies. So one of the big ideas in Chapter 3 is the way that British North America is divided into three distinct regions, each with its own economy, society, and its own way of life. Now, let's start with New England. In colonies like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the economy was based on small-scale farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. These colonies are also very deeply religious, largely because they are settled by Puritans who are looking to create a godly society. And town meetings and local church governance played a central role in shaping New England political culture. Now, I will say this, just because they're all religious doesn't mean they all agree on what that religion should look like. Rhode Island and Connecticut broke away from Massachusetts because there was a disagreement in how church relationship with government ought to be. Roger Williams leaves Massachusetts because he criticized the government of Massachusetts Bay Colony. So did Anne Hutchinson, who joins him in Rhode Island with her family as well. Connecticut was founded by Reverend Thomas Hooker, and again because he thought there should be more voice of the people outside of the religious side of things. And so again, even though they have some similarities, there are also some differences too that's worth noting. Now, if we move down the map, in the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, these colonies were much more diverse in terms of ethnic and religious population and mindset. You had the English, of course, we've talked about them. But the Dutch are still there, even if they don't control anything. You've had German settlers, particularly in the backcountry of Pennsylvania. You had Swedes that had settled in what is today New Jersey. There's a town there called Swedestown because Swedish settlers had settled there. You're going to eventually see the Scots-Irish. These are and Scottish Presbyterians moving into the area. The middle colonies were known for rich farmland producing crops like wheat, which had earned them the nickname the breadbasket colonies. They are producing the foodstuffs that's going to keep the colonies alive, and also much of which is shipped to England to feed the growing population of England as well. Now, Section 3, dealing with slavery and the transatlantic trade, one of the most significant and tragic aspects of British North America is the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, as the demand for labor in southern colonies grew, so did the importation of enslaved Africans. Now, by the mid-1600s, slavery had become entrenched, particularly in the South, but the northern colonies like New York and Massachusetts participated in the trade by transporting goods and enslaved people. Slavery before the American Revolution was also present in the colonies. One of the most famous slaves in Massachusetts at the time of the American Revolution was a woman by the name of Phyllis Wheatley, and she's a very accomplished poet, but she's still a slave. So the South isn't the only one that finds itself sort of trapped in this system. The transatlantic slave trade, though, is a brutal system. Forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas, and they were subject to inhumane conditions and forced labor along the way. If you look at the greatest number of slaves transported out of Africa, where did most of them go in the New World? They go to the Caribbean islands. Millions go to the Caribbean islands and Brazil. When you look at the number imported into the North American English colonies, all the way from Georgia up to Maine, the number's around 400,000. So it's a small percentage, but it's not an insignificant number either. Now, slavery created a racial hierarchy that would have a lasting impact on society. Enslaved people were treated as property, and laws were passed that made slavery permanent by the middle part of the 1600s. Maryland was one of the first. Virginia comes along afterward with some court cases dealing with a man by the name of, I lost his name, Anthony Johnson and John Casser. So if you want to look those up. But this system laid the foundation for deep social, economic, and racial divides. Now in Section 4, religious life and the Great Awakening. Religion is going to play a role from the very beginning, especially in colonies like the New England colonies, but it's also important everywhere we go. Now, again, a key aspect, even if it's not shaping your everyday life, it's still going to play a role in your outlook. If death is all around you, where you're going in the afterlife is something you're going to think about. Now, the Puritans, of course, had built strong influence in the northern colonies, and as I said, in the southern colonies, it's still going to be important as well. Now, by the early 1700s, a wave of religious revivals will start to spread through the colonies, and this becomes known as the Great Awakening. Now, preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, that's spelled Whitefield, but Whitefield, brought emotional, passionate sermons to towns and cities, urging colonists to seek a personal connection with God. And this Great Awakening is going to emphasize individual faith and spiritual equality. It's going to challenge traditional church authority, and we're going to start to see new denominations break out from this. Even Benjamin Franklin, in his, I think he probably around 1750, writes an autobiography. He writes of an event in 1739 where he meets Whitefield. He listens to his sermons, and he discusses just how powerful this man's preaching really was. Now, these revivals are going to cross regional boundaries, social boundaries. It's going to unite the colonies in new ways. If you're George Whitefield and you preach the same sermon in Georgia and then in the Carolinas and then up into Virginia and various parts of Virginia, and then you go up into Maryland and you travel on up into Pennsylvania and so on and so forth, everybody hears the same sermons. You are developing thought processes and patterns around same central ideas. So there's going to be a unifying fact to this Great Awakening. It's also going to have political consequences because it's encouraging ideas of independence, of equality that would later influence many in the American Revolution. And we start to hear people refer to themselves as Americans instead of as British or Englishmen. We start hearing people say, I'm American, because again, we're being united through these political and social and philosophical ideas that's coming down throughout this movement, as well as a scientific movement called the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment, this is going to be a period of time that greatly influences the colonies also, where we start looking at philosophical thought. What is the nature of government? And men like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and various others, their ideas are going to play a tremendous role in the shaping of our views of this new government. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is largely going to be a document that reflects the views of Enlightenment thinker John Locke, who's long dead by the time the American Revolution comes along, but his ideas remain. In many ways, because we see his books printed in the relatively new invention, a couple hundred years old, called the printing press. Now, despite being a part of the British Empire, we're in Section 5 now, the colonies had a long history of self-government. Each colony had its own assembly, and where elected representatives made local laws and collected taxes. Now, these assemblies gave colonists a taste of democracy and control over their own affairs. Now, over time, the colonists are going to begin to see themselves not just as subjects of the British Crown, but as citizens with rights. And by the 18th century, many colonists are going to believe that they are entitled to the same rights as English citizens. Just because we're colonists doesn't mean that we are different from our brethren over across the pond. And this included the right to representation in government. And this is a big issue as we move it down the road to revolution. So this growing sense of political independence set the stage for future conflicts with Britain, and the seeds of revolution are being planted even as the colonies thrive economically and socially under British rule. So let's conclude this chapter. What can we take away from chapter 3? British North America it's complex. It's a diverse place. The colonies developed different regional identities, economies, social systems, and they are all deeply tied to Britain and the broader Atlantic world. Now, at the same time, the experiences of indigenous peoples, Native Americans, American Indians if you prefer, enslaved Africans, European settlers, created the foundation for many of the social and political issues that would come to define American history. Now, this chapter reminds us that colonies were not just a precursor to the United States. They are vibrant societies in their own right with deep connections to the world beyond their borders. But these connections brought challenges, and eventually those challenges and how we deal with those challenges are going to lead us to the American Revolution. So thank you for joining me in this brief review of Chapter 3, British North America. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe for more history breakdowns. Particularly if you just need a quick review over the chapters in Unit 1, or Volume 1 of the American Yawp textbook. I'll see you in the next video.